Hello everybody. For this video I visited Boscastle on the north coast of Cornwall to photograph the last of the winter sky as it sets in the southwest. This is actually the third time I've been to Boscastle. The previous two trips weren't too successful because of the clouds, so I'm hoping on this trip that third time lucky. Now the conditions were looking fantastic at this time, but cloud was forecast to come in a little bit later. So after a short walk along the coastal path, I came across my first viewpoint, which looks over the river and the cliffs and had Orion in the background lined up nicely. My first image of the night was taken at ISO 6400 at 24mm f2.8 with an exposure of 15 seconds. I angled the camera up slightly to get more of the sky and used a Starglow filter for a few seconds through the exposure. I then aimed the camera lower down slightly to capture more of the foreground and took this photograph at ISO 1600 and 24mm still with an aperture of 2.8 and an exposure of 250 seconds. So I carefully merged the foreground and sky frames together in Photoshop to produce this final image. I really like how the river snakes through the scene and the sky just looked fantastic. At this point I then got myself back onto the cliff path and started to have a little explore to see what other compositions I could find.
So what I was trying to say through this clip was I moved about 100 yards along the cliff and positioned myself directly above the pier. Obviously the composition is quite similar to my previous viewpoint, but by moving that extra 100 yards along the cliff, Orion's position over the scene had slightly improved, I felt, and also being above the pier below me allowed the pier itself to act as a nice leading line. And I think there's something wrong when you do find a good composition to try a few slight alterations, because it's really hard to gauge actually on the location itself which view might look best. I'd rather take a few different compositions of a similar view and then allow me to have a bit of time once home to then decide on which composition was actually stronger. And then another cool thing that happened while I was taking some foreground frames was the International Space Station actually appeared over the scene, which was kind of unexpected but made a nice interesting element to this view.
So my first sky frame from this viewpoint was taken at ISO 6400 at 24mm with an aperture of 2.8 and an exposure of 15 seconds. I also held the Starglow filter in front of the camera for a few seconds of the exposure. I then took one foreground frame with the camera lowered slightly at ISO 3200 at 24mm with an aperture of 2.8 and an exposure of 120 seconds. With the settings kept the same, I then lowered the angle of view a little bit more and captured a second exposure. I then merged those two exposures together to create this foreground frame. And finally, like before, I then carefully merged the two foreground and sky frames together in Photoshop to produce this final image of this scene. As you can see, Orion is now a little bit lower in the sky from this viewpoint, and unlike the previous composition, the pier really leads you into the scene. So my third composition of the evening was taken from the same location, but this time at 14mm. So this is the sky frame of that at ISO 6400 with a 20-second exposure at f2.8. I then took a foreground exposure at ISO 1600 with an aperture of f2.8 and an exposure of 121 seconds, and fortunately through that exposure I managed to capture the International Space Station streaking across the sky. I then, in Photoshop, like my previous images, carefully merged the foreground and the sky frame together, and I also did some careful editing to bring out the International Space Station streak to create this final image. So now it was time to scramble back up the cliff and find a slightly different viewpoint for the final composition of the night. I find it a bit of a struggle to find an interesting composition, but my first kind of image from this viewpoint was this sky frame taken at ISO 6400 at 25mm with an aperture of 2.8 and an exposure of 15 seconds. At this stage you can see Orion was getting very low on the horizon and looking quite interesting. So for the foreground frame, I decided to get into the scene myself, just add a little bit of scale and interest. And this was taken at ISO 6400 this time, at 25mm with an aperture of 2.8 and an exposure of 60 seconds. This concludes my video from this shoot. It was fantastic to finally get some really nice conditions at Boscastle and an opportunity to get a few different compositions from here. If you have any questions at all, then please feel free to drop me a comment below, and thank you for watching.